Good evening. I'm Corvallis Advocate Moderator Kara Nixon, and co-moderating with me tonight is Oregon State University journalism instructor Jillian St. Jacques. As well as being affiliated with the Advocate, I am also a news contributor for The Barometer, the student-run newspaper at OSU. Welcome to tonight's CitySpeak forum. Jillian.
CitySpeaks are presented by the Corvallis Advocate, which offers daily news online and in non-pandemic times, a twice-monthly deep dive print publication, along with live forums and storytelling nights. CitySpeaks are co-presented by the City Club of Corvallis, a volunteer-run nonprofit organization that seeks to present a diversity of viewpoints and constructive dialogue. Next Tuesday, with the school board election approaching, CitySpeak will host candidates debate with a short forum on the public safety levy, which also will be on the ballot. Details will be on sites for the Corvallis Advocate and City Club tomorrow morning. Kara?
Partial funding for these forums comes from Peak Sports and First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op. However, we cannot present CitySpeak without support from viewers like you. Please consider a subscription. Visit our site. There are $5 and $10 levels, and donations over and above are, of course, always welcome. This is an opportunity for you to do something that is increasingly rare, which is to support a news outlet that's actually locally run. If you aren't yet a subscriber, please consider joining the group of people that are. Tonight, we discuss the future of local journalism for consumers and reporters and how the pandemic has impacted local news organizations and their readers. Our first panel is brief, including instructors teaching future journalists. They are Jennifer Moody from Oregon State University, who is the journalism advisor for Orange Media Network, Jillian St. Jacques, who is an OSU journalism senior instructor and coordinator of the Applied Journalism minor, and Rob Pruey, who is from Lynn Benton Community College and is a journalism instructor. Jillian.
Our main panel will include editors, publishers, and managers who are working in the trenches every day. I'd like to welcome Camilla Mortensen, editor of Eugene Weekly, Steve Humphrey, editor of the Portland Mercury, Stephen Forrester, publisher of EO Media, JC Kalama, editor-in-chief of OSU's Daily Barometer, Jim Rondeau, station manager of KLCC-FM, and Stephen Schultz, publisher of the Corvallis Advocate.
All right, in a few moments, we'll turn to audience questions. So to ask a question while we're live, viewers can comment on the event's live post on our Facebook page, The Corvallis Advocate, or email us at cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. Again, that's cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. So we're first going to start out with panelist Jennifer Moody, who is, again, the journalism advisor for Orange Media Network at OSU. So could we just get a minute on your history as both a journalist and a journalism advisor for OMN?
Sure. I have been a community journalist since 1992, and most of that time was with the Albany Democrat Herald. I was there from fall of 1995 all through 2018. I took the job as the journalism advisor at Oregon State in January of 2019, and that is where I've been since. I have, in the community journalism side of things, because the papers I worked with were small, done just about everything on the news side of things, that is photography, sports, business, police and fire, city government, schools, just about everything. And so I endeavor to help the students that I advise learn the benefits of doing all those things as well. And my motto, which I keep on a Post-it on my at-home workspace, which is where I've been since last March, is teach them what you've learned. And that's what I'm here to do.
Great. And then with that experience as a working journalist, can you kind of talk about the pros and cons of that career?
It's the best job I've ever had in my life, and I miss it very much. As much as I love the students, I love you, JC, love you, Kara, love all of the students I work with. The day-to-day of chasing a story was an honor and a privilege, and I miss it. But I couldn't live on it. My life circumstances changed, and I was not able to sustain the bills as I knew them. If I'd sold everything and bought a van, maybe, but I didn't. So I needed to find something that I could continue to work with people in emphasizing what I believe is necessary and needed in this world. But I was no longer in a position to be able to offer it myself. So I am privileged. I feel it is an honor and a privilege to work with people who may one day carry that torch. I just couldn't do it anymore.
Got it. And then working for OMN, you would know about this. Can you talk about a bit about how the pandemic has affected student journalism?
None of us really knew what that was going to be like. I'm sure everyone can say the same here. We didn't, when we left our bullpen, which is our newsroom back in March 2020, nobody knew how long it was going to be, a week, a month, finish out spring break and come back, finish out spring term and come back. We didn't know. And so we just prepared for everything we could think of. We put the other professional staff and myself put everything that we would have been doing with students in person online as quickly as we could. We put together all of our introductory meetings, all of our modules, all of our forms and documents that we need people to sign when they are interested in being hired or being a volunteer. We set up Zoom meeting times. We practiced with cameras. I've had on and off microphone issues ever since. So every day is a new adventure with technology. But we are lucky at OMN in that, with the exception of photography, most of what we can do as journalists, we can continue to do online. We don't have to, the bullpen is wonderful and I wish we had it. A newsroom experience is like no other, but we don't need it in the way that TV needs it, say. So we are able to make phone calls. We are able to do Zoom meetings. We are able to do an awful lot of reporting from wherever we happen to be. And so that has kept us, I think, viable. And I think that those are good tools for moving into the future, however journalism ends up looking.
Right. And that kind of leads into my next question, which is, what are your thoughts or concerns for the future of local journalism specifically?
Well, my concerns are pretty broad-based. The industry, as we used to know it, in terms of what it used to look like and how it used to be delivered, is collapsing. I don't know how to stop that. I don't know if that's even necessarily a bad thing. We evolve and change as a species, and we find new ways of delivering messages. And so I don't think we're going to see print much longer. Nobody younger than me that I know of reads daily papers very often. Certainly my children do not. So I think our future is digital and is multimedia, and that is what I would like to help people learn to concentrate on. But I do think, I have been very fervent in saying this, and I continue to say this, that the demand for what we do as journalists will not go away. People need a place that they can go for information they can trust, that is timely and relevant to their personal circumstances, and they will find a way to get it. If we, meaning this industry, does not exist, and if it collapses completely, somebody will bring it back. Someone will reinvent it because people need it. They want it. They will find a way to make it happen. What is broken right now is the pay model. I do not know how to fix that. And I do not, and smarter people than me haven't figured this out yet either. So that's the key, is how do we, most people cannot afford to work for free very long. So how do we fix that part?
Right. Thank you, Jen. We'll now be moving on to Rob Pruitt, who is from LBCC, and he's a journalism instructor. Rob, could we just get a minute on your history as well?
Sure, Kara. Thanks for inviting me this evening to be part of the panel. My experience kind of mirrors Jen in some ways. I arrived in Corvallis in 1986, just after the election of Neil Goldschmidt. And this was my first real job after growing up in the Midwest and traveling out west for my first job at the GT. And little did I know that I was going to be at the Corvallis Gazette-Times for more than 20 years. And most of those years, started as the education reporter, then covered cops and local government and business. But I found that my strength was more mentoring other reporters and working as an editor. And so I gradually gravitated over to that side of the business and served as, city editor and copy editor. And eventually I was the editor-in-chief at the Corvallis Gazette-Times at the time that we merged with the Democrat Herald. And those were truly interesting times here in the Valley for news. I know at that time, both newsrooms had more than 20 people working in them. They both had huge presses that shook the building. And I fondly remember the days of, literally having to walk back and say, stop the presses when big news was happening. And, I like to consider myself privileged to have sort of lived through those kind of glory days of print journalism. Things changed, however, and eventually I left the newspaper and was very fortunate to land over at LBCC teaching journalism. And, at this moment, I'm kind of monitoring my text messages because my students are right in the process of finishing up their weekly paper. Normally on a Tuesday, like Jen said, I'd be on campus or in the newsroom or answering their questions or, whatnot. But, right now in this virtual world, we're all working from home and it has its advantages and its disadvantages. But like Jen said, it's just different, but it's still news.
Right, great, thank you. And then kind of going off of your journalism instructor, so thinking about the students you have now, has their profile kind of changed over the years? Are you seeing different types of students now than you were before?
Yeah, they've definitely changed over the years. And that's not to say that they're better or worse or stronger or weaker or smarter or not. They're just a whole different type of student with different interests, different backgrounds. I mean, when I was their age, I was still immersed in a newspaper culture where we got a newspaper every day at my house. We watched John Chancellor on NBC News every night. There's 4 channels on the TV, and it was just a very different media environment. Whereas now I've got students who literally have, never had a newspaper delivered to their home. They've never regularly been a newspaper reader. They may pick one up occasionally if they see it, at a newsstand or at the table next to them at New Morning Bakery. But it's just a very different media environment, as Jen noted. And at the same time, they're still getting their news and they are engaged in society and in their communities, probably as passionate now about influencing and making a difference in their community as they've ever been. But unlike our generation, speaking for myself, they don't view the newspaper or the media, I don't think, as a vehicle to make social change anymore. Where that was one of the reasons I got into journalism, was I could make a difference through the reporting I did and the editing we did and the stories we put out there. But students now have all kinds of different ways to make an impact. They've got their own networks through social media. They've got their own communities, and they feel that they don't necessarily need the media to help make a difference in their community.
Mm-hmm. And then from your perspective as an instructor, again, can you talk about how the pandemic has affected student journalism?
Well, like I mentioned, it's totally changed the way that we do the work we do. And when we actually get back to campus, hopefully this fall, we're going to have to think seriously about, what we're going to keep and what we're going to go back to. I don't know that we'll necessarily go back to doing anything the way we used to. One of the things is when you look at the PDF, online version of our paper, you've got these beautiful pictures and graphics and color on every single page. And the students are like, why would I want to change that photo to black and white when it looks so great on page 7 of our paper today? And so I think things like that are radically going to change how we look at our distribution model, how we present the news. And who knows, maybe we'll print the paper once a month and call it Best of the Commuter. Who knows, but that's a discussion that I'm really looking forward to having with my students come this summer and fall.
Mm-hmm. And then going off of talking about the future, what are your thoughts or concerns for the future of local journalism?
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record and agree with Jennifer again, but I agree. People find the news. And whether it's a profit-making enterprise that's providing it for them, or if we evolve to some kind of new nonprofit model or a stronger subscription model, or who knows, maybe the Advocate takes over the Valley. You never know. But it's going to be exciting to watch and see what happens.
Thank you, Rob. Well, We'll now be moving on to Jillian St. Jacques. He's moderating our next panel, but he's also an OSU journalism instructor and the coordinator for the Applied Journalism minor. So could we get a minute on your history?
Sure, Kara, and thank you, Steve, for having me tonight and for sponsoring these CitySpeaks events, because they're the backbone of any vibrant and hip community. And like many communities much larger, Corvallis resembles Eugene and other communities that need these types of events that only seem to be sponsored by local media. And thank you for carrying the torch for this particular event. My own history with journalism, like pretty much everybody else here, is circuitous. I came to journalism late after getting a couple of degrees in fine arts, but those weren't paying the bills, and I was getting my writing published from time to time. So I went back to school. I retrained again. I got a second bachelor's degree in journalism to pay the bills, and it's been paying the bills ever since. I graduated from CalArts Northridge in 1995 and got my first job after I moved out east to Rochester, New York, which was a huge culture shift, at a community weekly newspaper. The paper was more conservative than I actually cared for, but I wrote for them for several years. After that, I stepped out of the newspaper business and got a job as a press secretary for a gubernatorial campaign in upstate New York. I thought beforehand that I would always want to get into politics, even more actually than print journalism. But just like so many things in life, once you get your head behind the scenes and see what really goes on, sometimes you realize the thing you really thought you wanted to do isn't the thing that you actually really want to do. And that's what I found out behind the scenes as a press secretary in politics. It wasn't a world that I really enjoyed, and in fact was quite toxic to me. To other people, they're very excited by all kinds of backdoor wheelings and dealings, and I found a lot of that pretty distressing. So after that, I went into public relations, which seemed like a more lucrative way to pay the bills. And I like PR just fine. And that's how I concluded my time in New York. But my wife is Finnish. And when she finished her doctorate degree at University of Rochester, we moved back to Finland. And suddenly, because I've always worked my entire life, being a boomer, I'm no stranger to a work ethic. When I got to Finland, though, there was nothing much to do in journalism. And I remember calling the AP bureau in Helsinki, which was the only English-speaking thing around, really. And they said, well, we have 3 reporters here. They've been here for 15 years, and none of them are dying right now. So you can go do whatever. And so I was like, well, what else can I do? And because I was a native speaker of English, I was able to teach, and I got a very good job at Polytechnic University, Lauria Polytechnic. And actually, there was a call for eventually to teach journalism to non-native speakers. And I just fell in love with teaching. I liked the lifestyle. I liked the liberty. I liked the freedom with my schedule, that when I wrote, I could write what I wanted. So there was a lot to like about teaching. And when I came back to the States with my wife, who got a job at Oregon State University, I hinted that maybe she could get me one too. And lo and behold, I had an adjunct position for one class a term to begin with. And then I had the temerity to ask for more, and then I got a full load, and I've been there ever since. That was in 2004. So I should make a pitch for the journalism program, which eventually we started at OSU. As you know, Oregon State downsized its journalism program in 1992. There was a vibrant major there at one time, but for budgetary reasons and other reasons, perhaps, they downsized the program. And eventually, the department that I worked for, the School of Writing, Literature, and Film, brought it back. So now we have a new journalism minor that we're looking to hopefully one day turn into a major. And journalism education is alive and well. Now, what I want to say about that, though, before I cut my diatribe short, is that journalism at OSU wasn't dead. In fact, I want to really stress that even though they took the program apart, the students didn't stop making the newspaper, and they kept that alive and continue to keep it alive. And in fact, they grew it. They even won national awards in the absence of a journalism department, raising all kinds of conjecture about journalism education to begin with. And if you know about newspaper history, in the old days, you didn't learn journalism at college anyway. You worked at a newspaper, and they taught you the way to do it. So but this sea change then has given us the ability to create something new from scratch. And so what we're emphasizing over in applied journalism is multimedia journalism in particular, because we have so many students from so many disparate areas that are coming together now to try and find out how they're going to make their living doing what they like to do. And the truth is we have very few newspaper journalists compared to magazines and people that want to work in magazines, or broadcast people that would like to go into video. And then we have some public relations people that want to go into advertising. So when you think about what all that has in common, a lot of that's multimedia, people that are fluid in making stories with all kinds of media. And that's what we're specializing in now.
Great. And then you kind of just mentioned this, but how do you think students have changed over the years, journalism students?
You know, I have to say, when I started at OSU in 2004, having come from Finland, I was a little bit disappointed in the quality of students that were coming through my classrooms. And it seemed like, and maybe it was because there was no journalism program or whatever, but the students, a lot of times weren't putting everything into their assignments. And what I've found these days, though, especially in the last 5 years, and this is fascinating for me because this happened after former President Ed Ray increased the enrollment at Oregon State University. And when he did that, I thought, oh man, he wants to skyrocket the enrollment. The quality of students is going to go down. This is life right now, right? It didn't. The opposite happened. And so now the students I've found are much, much better than before. And the thing that I've sort of started tracing this down to is I think students are getting a better high school education, actually, which is kind of a relief to me, having two kids that are about the age that they're going to march into high school in a couple of years. It's good to see. So the students that I see coming in, they have a lot of energy, and they really want to make a difference compared to like in 2004 when I started teaching, where there was a lot of clockers. They were like, oh, I want to get a degree and a good job and settle down and have a wife and kid and blah, blah, blah. Like now people have much more specific and intelligent goals that I can really relate to. So I think the quality of students has actually seriously increased since 2004.
Great. And then can you talk a bit about how you feel journalism students have been affected by the pandemic?
To tell you the truth, when I look at everything, and we've got JC Kalama, the editor-in-chief of the OSU Barometer, with us this evening. When I look at everything that this paper has done, again, in spite of this pandemic, seriously though, when you look at the online edition of this paper, it's doing as well or better than it did before, dealing with incredibly complicated issues that have arisen during not just pandemic issues, which would already blow people off the map, but this whole thing about the board of trustees and this lousy hire of a new president, and all of the coverage that the Barometer has actually done of all this stuff. Story after story, really hard to write stories have come their way, hard stories to interview, to get people to talk about these things. The Barometer has come to task on all of these things. So if anything, I think all the news in the air has improved the publication, which was already quite good. Like I said, it already won many awards, and this year I noticed that they've won some awards too. I think student media, I see it just getting better and better. And again, I attribute a lot of that to the fluidity, like Rob was saying, the fluidity of students dealing with a variety of media forms and being able to create new kind of compelling stories instead of like column to column stories.
Right. And then as someone who's worked in journalism and now teaches future journalists, what are your thoughts or concerns for the future of local journalism?
Well, I'm really enthused again to see Steve and the Advocate bringing the community back into community journalism. And I'm not going to say much more about whatever news vacuum was in Corvallis before the Advocate, but Corvallis is a very politically aware and very vibrant community that I feel before the Advocate emerged, to be quite honest, was a little bit underserved. But now with the presence of the Advocate, I'm optimistic about local journalism, and as well as student journalism. So yeah.
Yeah, and then we actually have time for one more question for all of our first panelists. So I'll start with Jen. What advantages, technology or otherwise, do you think future reporters will have?
Advantages? Well, I guess they'll have the advantage of having lived in a digital world for longer than I have. Um, that is how news will be created as well as it is already being consumed. And so if people are used to that, then they're going to have that rhythm of what that looks like. Something Rob said earlier made me think about that. I grew up watching television broadcasters and reading local newspapers. So when I started writing for them, I wouldn't say I was necessarily that great, but I had an idea of how that felt, what the rhythm was supposed to look like, how a lead was supposed to work, how you put in a quote, because I read that. I read a lot of that. So future journalists, I think, will have an idea of what that needs to look like and sound like in a multimedia setting. They will have more experience with creating websites, more experience with short videos, more experience with what to show on camera and how to set that off to its best advantage and how to get a good sound clip. And for all those reasons, those will be advantages. I won't say that I am terrible at multimedia because I honestly don't know. I haven't tried it. I was old school in my old job because I could get away with that. And I can't anymore. No journalist can. And so I am learning right now how to do video and audio. And the advantage of my students will have is that they are already born into that world and will do it, therefore, automatically better than I will.
Right. Thank you. And then Rob, the same question to you. And if you want to talk about disadvantages as well, that works.
Sure. When I arrived at the Gazette Times way back in the day as an entry-level education reporter, I thought, my career trajectory was to end up at the New York Times. But, it quickly dawned on me, just like all my peers, that, I kind of liked living in Oregon. And, to work at the New York Times, you'd have to live in New York and move all across country. The big thing I see for our future journalists is they can follow their passion and never have to leave Corvallis, Oregon or Albany, Oregon. They want to be, the best Blazers reporter in the history of the earth. They can do that from Albany or Corvallis. And that's one of the benefits that we're finding during this pandemic is that you have access that's unparalleled. And if you're passionate and you're good enough, the New York Times is going to pick up on that. And they're going to say, that guy out in Albany, Oregon, we ought to hire him because he's amazing. And I think I'm really excited for my students in that regard, in that I think the technology will open up so many avenues where they can both balance a lifestyle choice where they want to live and where they can afford to live with who they want to work for and where they want to have their work published. And for me, that's really exciting.
Great, thank you. And then I'll pose the question lastly to Jillian. So what advantages or disadvantages do you think future reporters will have?
Well, a lot like Jen was saying, I think the prowess that students have already with digital media that are so new to us that aren't new to them. Like when I ask my students, well, where do you get your news? I get my news these days because I don't have that many print subscriptions either anymore, but I get my news mainly from Google News, which is a news warehouser. And I always think they'll say Google News, but they never do. That's already old. Google News is old stuff. It's old, right? What they say is, I get my news from Reddit. I get my news from Twitter, and then my eyes start rolling around. I'm like, Twitter, 140 characters. How can you do it that way? Yeah, but you, and I'd hassle them about it. And eventually I had to realize, okay, no, you can get news that way. And in fact, it's a great way to get news, especially breaking news. It's instant on Twitter. So I think students, what I'm hoping with as an educator is that up until now, journalism in the news and news content like direction has always followed the technology. So telegraph comes first, news gets a hold of it. Usually the military gets a hold of it first, and then news years later. The same thing with the internet, which started as ARPANET, which was a military thing. It lasted for 5 or 10 years. News, they weren't going to deal with it, but eventually they jumped on it. They ran with it. Now everything's internet. I'm hoping eventually now students that are graduating are going to start turning this paradigm on its head, and they're going to come up with new technologies that are even better for dealing with news. That's like my wildest dreams, is that students will emerge with their own technologies that work even better than anything, and that the news is at the front of making the technology and the delivery model, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Jen, Rob, and Jillian for being on our first panel. We're now going to turn to our next panel, so I'll bring it back to you, Jillian.
Okay, great. And as we go along, I'd like to invite our viewers to post questions to the live feed on our Facebook page, or you can shoot an email to the folks at CitySpeak at corvallisadvocate.com, and we'll try to work your questions into the roster. Now, I'd like to begin our session with Camilla Morganson, the editor of Eugene Weekly. Camilla, could you give us just a minute or two about your history and about Eugene Weekly? We'd also like to know a bit about the challenges and opportunities for Eugene Weekly and what the Weekly's experienced both before and after the pandemic.
Sure. I actually came to journalism in through the back door. I have a master's degree in folklore and mythology and a PhD in comparative literature, which is what brought me to Oregon. I got a job writing a thesaurus for the Library of Congress and discovered that I liked writing, but I wanted to write more than just the words that I was giving synonyms and such for. I decided my dream job was going to be writing and teaching, which if someone had told me that now, I'd be like, seriously? So I applied for a job at Eugene Weekly. I saw they were hiring an environmental reporter, and I was like, oh my God, I could totally do that. And talked my way into it. So they hired me. At the time, one of the owners of the paper was Fred Taylor, the managing editor and editor of the Wall Street Journal. And he used to phone in with comments on the paper or write notes with comments on the paper. So that's how I learned what a nut graph was, kind of learned on the fly. I also teach, and so I do tell my students sometimes that you can teach everything you want, but sometimes you just have to jump in and start doing things. I worked my way up from reporter to associate editor. They asked me if I would apply to be editor. I said no. And then I wound up the editor, still not entirely certain how that happened. And actually I teach part-time at Lane Community College. I teach journalism and I'm the editor of the paper. So I pulled off what I was going to do, albeit in a strange sort of way. Eugene Weekly is currently printing about 30,000 copies a week during the pandemic. That's down from our normal 37 to 39,000 that we were printing before the pandemic. We can't keep the papers in the stands. We have what's probably about a 1% to 2% return rate each week, meaning that's what's left over. The gardeners are super pissed because they always come get our leftovers and use them in their garden, and they can't right now. We would print more, but of course, with COVID reduced advertising, we are not able to print more papers than we're currently printing right now. But I have to say, for the naysayers about print, don't tell my readers that. They are very print heavy. They love the print paper. We did have a discussion about stopping printing when the pandemic began, and we decided that the outcry that we would get from readers of the loss of their crossword puzzle would make it not worth stopping printing, and we are really glad we didn't stop. We have made it through with a couple of the PPP loans. We went ahead and made it, I don't want to call it a deal with the devil because we didn't actually make a deal, but we did go ahead and get a grant from Facebook and another grant from Google and a Google News intern. So there was probably about $40,000 in grants that we got in. We got some other grants. And we had never asked for support before for our readers. The owners of the paper, which is Fred Taylor died a couple years ago. His wife is still an owner, and another local couple, Art and Anita Johnson, have never taken profit out of the paper, and they never will. So there was no profit margin to cut into. But when we we asked readers if they wanted to contribute. And I think last I checked, it was about $14,000 in contributions, which for a paper that is not a nonprofit and didn't really know how to ask for money, it just kind of said help. It was remarkable. And also just the notes we got from readers saying how much the paper meant to us. And that's everything from our regular sort of classic liberal readers to actually we have a lot of conservative readers, and they basically expressed appreciation for what we were doing, which was great. So that's kind of where we stand right now.
So Camilla, can you tell us a little bit about what the paper looked like when the lockdown hit and what happened immediately following and how you've dealt with all that?
I'm laughing because the last issue that we printed before the lockdown hit was Swizzle, the nightlife issue, where to go out and have fun on the weekend. Score. That was great. That didn't pan out so well. And the last interview we did before things got really serious was the county and local store owners all saying, don't you worry, it's all gonna be fine. Just support local business. And we were like, so it's super not fine. So we then did a quick pivot. I believe, actually I have a really tiny version of our first cover that we did after that, which was, we will get through this. I'm putting my finger over the hashtag. We did print the F-bomb, stay the home. A lot of people liked that. A lot of people were offended to this day. I can't believe that they get offended by the paper that runs Savage Love, but still sometimes they do. The paper we were printing, I will say when I started the weekly, we were probably printing an average of 36 to 40 page papers. That has gone down. When the pandemic hit, our sort of bottom line paper was 28 pages. I'm gonna randomly grab a paper, last week's paper, for tabloid format, so up and down by 4 pages each time. Since the pandemic began, I will say we're probably printing about 16 pages, which feels terrifying. However, that said, the benefit of not having that many ads is that we have actually pretty decent room for content. So we're still getting in. Our news stories are about the same. We're probably running one less online, or sorry, one less in print than we were before. And our cover story is the same, and we're smashing our art stuff a little bit more. Part of our grant was to actually boost our online coverage. The daily paper here, the RG, has much lower staffing. The Register Guard has much lower staff than they've had in the past. So we were paying interns and young writers to do meetings coverage. And we're still doing online meetings coverage as much as we can. It's a really great way to train young journalists. And we do get web hits. I think we're about 40,000 unique visitors a month, but actually still doesn't compare to our print. So we were ready to pivot to online. But in all honesty, print is still where our readers' hearts are. And so that's still where we are.
And Camilla, one last question. And that is, I'm going to go off map here for a second. When you, because this isn't lost on me that you say that your print hasn't gone down, because so many people's has, and what that indicates to someone like me is that you guys are doing something different. And so I'd like to talk about that, as to a little bit about why you feel that the weekly's still alive and vibrant, and that their print's just as vibrant when you hear so many complaints in other sectors about the print going down.
I think we are an odd combination of a community weekly and an alt weekly. We have the fun and the snark of an alt weekly. We can't get as snarky and offbeat, I think, as Steve Humphrey over at Portland Mercury can, because it hurts our readers' feelings. They also see us as a community paper, and they're like, we're there to like run happening people and do a positive little story about a community member each week. And I think it's kind of partly that sort of odd combination of being both those things. Also, having talked to some of our conservative readers before, they've never minded that we are, well, some of them do. We get some really entertaining phone calls. I shouldn't say that. Some of them don't mind that we are liberal, that we're pro-environment, etc., because they never feel like we snuck up on them. They don't feel like we pretend to be objective, or that we pretend to be unbiased and then suddenly show up as biased. They feel like they know what they're getting into when they're reading us, that we are going to be pro the environment, we are going to be pro the small business over the big business. And I think there's a level of trust that comes with that. The other thing we have, a lot of other papers don't have as much, and maybe it's a thing unique to the Eugene-Lane County area, is we have a really vibrant letters section. I talked to other newspaper editors who don't have that. I don't want to say it's a problem. It's actually an awesome problem to have. I get more letters than I can print. We really have a very interactive readership, which is, I think, also really, really helps for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Camilla. I'd like to turn over now to Steve Humphrey, the editor of Portland Mercury. Steve, if you could begin by telling us a little bit about your own history and life at the Portland Mercury, and about how you came back and returned to the Pacific Northwest, and maybe about some of the challenges and opportunities that have arisen for the Portland Mercury post-pandemic.
Sure. Hi, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. So I grew up in Alabama, and I wound my way up to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and that's where I was in theater and directing and playwriting classes, and I was in the same classes with Dan Savage, who you might know of Savage Love. And I was really good friends with Tim Keck, who was at the Madison, Wisconsin. He had started The Onion, which you may have heard of. And so we were all palling around, and then we graduated. And then Tim moved to Seattle, Washington. I went to South Carolina. Was working at a TV station there. And I was hating it. And so at some point, Tim called me up and said, like, hey, we're starting a new newspaper in Seattle. It's an alt weekly. It's called The Stranger. Do you want to come up and work on it? And I said, I'll see you in a week. And I threw everything in my car and drove up to Seattle, Washington. And that was in the grunge days. It was 1991. And it was a really fun time to build a newspaper. And there were like 8 of us in the original crew, including Savage. And we all lived together in a 2-bedroom apartment for about 3 months. And it was pretty nuts, but it was just a very exciting time to be there. And so I started out delivering papers and writing, and we all did everything. I tried to sell ads. I was terrible at it. So they took me off that immediately. But eventually worked my way up to being managing editor at The Stranger. And then we decided to spin off and move to Portland. And we started the Portland Mercury, and I became the editor there in 2000, and I still am, apparently. I'm still here, even after, what happened, a year ago. And that was like a big turning point for us, obviously, because at that point, we were probably doing 60-page papers, had a circulation of about 45,000, I believe. And we're doing this weekly paper. With recently, after with pretty much like a year before, we'd gone to bi-weekly, and because we were really boosting our online content, and so we're doing this print product and doing like a daily online, and so it was like incredibly difficult. But it was pretty rewarding at the same time. But then, so last March, I think it was around like March 14th, about a week or so before, the first person had died of COVID-19 in Seattle, Washington. And immediately, like the governor there started shutting everything down, which meant like the advertising out of The Stranger immediately dropped. And since they're our sister paper, we're the same company, that kicked the legs out of us at the same time. And so that's when we decided that we had to go online only immediately, and we had to lay off like a ton of people. Like I laid off 6 of our 9 editorial employees, which was like, that was the hardest day of my career for sure. And I still get pretty emotional about it. But so we said like, okay, well, let's see what we can do. We're gonna try to let's see if we can make it through this week. And so we jumped on our horse, and we had 3 editorial employees, myself, Alex Zielinski, and Blair Stenvik. And we said, we're just going to try to help people and try to get people through this pandemic, and because it's such a new thing for all of us. And so once we got through the week, we said, okay, let's see if we can make it to a month. And we began asking for contributions from our readers. And like Camilla said, they were just, I was just amazed with how much they stepped up to help us out. And so I was immediately humbled, and I always feel so privileged to do this job. But then, so we did that, and then we switched to also had a streaming model that we could also make money off of. So a lot of the same things that we did, that we advertised and we promoted, which was like music, comedy, and like films and stuff like that, we pivoted that to our streaming services. So we did like live comedy shows. We'd do like panels like this one. We would do music concerts and stuff like that. And so that brought us in some more money. And then eventually, like some of the businesses were able to kind of like start saying like, okay, I want to advertise with you online. And so they started doing that. And so we just played it by ear, week after week, month after month, until, you know, we've finally gotten to the point where we're feeling very stable. And we're just started hiring people back. We started to hired a new news reporter this week. So we're really excited about that.
So Stephen, what trends do you see happening right now in the industry that either concern you or relate to this topic of community journalism and getting through to the public and keeping news vibrant in communities right about now?
I think it's like really important that we listen to our readers and what they want. And because one thing the Mercury has always been about is about like talking to them rather than at them. That's our style. Our style is very conversational, but it's also like just like realizing that there's a person out there that is well, maybe not alone, but feels alone, and they don't have like a link to their community. And so we try like through like you know, our journalism and just like reviews and everything else is to try to pull them in, encourage them to be like a part of the community and like get out there and go do these things and get involved with City Hall. And like, here's how, you know, like, especially like now during the pandemic where, you know, you can't go stomp into City Hall and scream and yell. You have to kind of figure out how to do it on Zoom. So that's what we do. We say like, this is when like, you know, the meetings are going to be held. This is how you can, you know, put your voice in. And it's so important right now, like with police reform, houseless issue, there's so many things that people need to get involved with. So my concern is mostly just that people are going to feel so confined by the pandemic that they don't want to do that. But I'm still feeling a lot of energy coming out of the Portland area, especially. And I think that people are getting more excited and more involved.
Do you think that things also, I mean, because when we talk about post-pandemic and everything, we're also talking about the post-Trump era, and especially in Portland, how do you see things being more fraught? And is that going to de-escalate anytime soon, or is it going to spill over to other communities in Oregon? How do you see that playing out in the news as well, and coverage of the news and stories?
I don't know exactly what you mean. Do you mean like in protest or politically, or
Especially protest and politically? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit hard to say. We're always like, just when you think you got a handle on, oh, this is like where it's going, and this is how the protests are working. We had 100 days, over 100 days of straight protests, and we were out there pretty much like a lot of the nights. And so, you know, I was not always thrilled with the way some people did it. But, you know, they had their, you know, their voices, and I think that's what we should be doing, is like trying to listen to these voices primarily, and also trying to uplift them. And even if you don't happen to agree with it, because like people are coming from like politics from a lot of different angles, and being able to listen to them, and like especially like amplifying you know, people of color is like just such an important thing right now. And I think there's a lot of excitement behind that, and we're just like, we're riding the wave. We're riding the wave of, you know, giving people like letting those voices be heard, and to encourage people to get involved in however you want to do it. And it's not just by protesting either. There's a lot of different ways you can do it.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen, for appearing with us tonight.
Sure,
and
thank you.
hopefully we can circle around back to these issues as well. JC Kalama, editor-in-chief of the OSU Barometer. Can you tell us a little bit about your life with student media right now and how you see things having shifted perhaps at student media in the pandemic and the relationship to student media in Corvallis, as well in relationship to the rest of the media in Corvallis, especially now during this crisis?
Yeah, so my name is JC Kalama. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Barometer, which is Oregon State University student-run newspaper. I am a third-year new media communications major with an applied journalism minor, and I've been involved with the student newspaper since my freshman year. I was a news contributor, a news reporter, then I was the copy editor, news editor, and here I am as editor-in-chief. Um, it's been a very interesting year, a very active year. And it's been a good year as in coverage wise. I think we have done a really good job. I've had a lot of anxiety thinking about how much work there is to be done still. And that's really daunting because there's so much news happening, not just locally, but nationally, and how that relates back to our communities. Um, but I will say that I think that the Barometer is definitely competing with local newspapers. We added a city section in 2020 or 2019. And we did that just because we were seeing that there needed to be more coverage of Corvallis news. And our city section is still growing. Um, and when the pandemic hit in terms of printing, it was hard because we are mainly the university's newspaper and nobody was on campus anymore. And so all that we really had going for us if we were to continue printing was our city section, which was still small and growing. So the Barometer stopped printing in March, and we started up again in January. And we're just doing monthly special issues, 24 pages, printing 3,000 copies, and just kind of getting started back up. And it's been going really good. I'm really excited to be printing again. Um, but I will say, like Jen said, the transition was really easy to go remote, which is a little scary. Honestly, like way too easy. The only thing that we did in person was our cohort meetings to assign articles and our readouts with editors. And so those just moved to Zoom. And the hardest part of the pandemic, I think, for journalists was the mental health side of it. News never sleeps, and doesn't that's for all journalists, whether student media or not. And so at least like I could kind of switch off my work brain when I could leave the office. Now I have a really hard time stepping away from the job, and with the intensity of the news right now, um, I think the mental health side of journalism has been really, really hard, being completely honest. And I think that's the case for everyone. Anyone who's working remote, it's just harder. And so that's one thing that I've learned this year is to definitely take time to check in with people because I know what it's like to be a writer, not during a pandemic. And so I have to keep an open mind and work with the writers and community members.
Great, great, great. I think in journalism, all too often we overlook the incredible mental stress that even the most seasoned reporters go through all the time. And some people love that stress. Other people seek other careers because of prolonged exposure to that stress, like prolonged exposure to radiation, and eventually they can't stand it anymore, and they have to go recover someplace. Can you talk a little bit about that, about students? Because there's been so many stories that have come down the pike on your watch about students crumbling and how to get them back up in the seat again and get them reporting again if that's possible.
Yeah, so student journalists have to juggle a lot of things in life. They've got to keep up with their schoolwork. They got to make their deadlines for the job. They're probably making pretty big life decisions at this age, and so um, there's that. And then working online, having to change your entire life routine. Um, it's hard, and I can see that a lot of people are struggling, including me, and I'll catch myself, like, reading through work emails at 2 a.m., and I'm laying in bed, and I'm like, "I need to step away. I need to take some time off," and I think a lot of people are struggling to do that, and, like, I'll hear a siren go by. I heard one, like, 10 minutes ago, and I'm like, "Okay, is this something we need to cover?" It's just never ending, and that's the thing with news is it's never ending, and there's always things that can be covered and should be covered, and it gets really exhausting, and it's really important work, and, like, some people really thrive off of that. I don't know if I say I would, but yeah, it's been a really hard year for a lot of people. And personally, I think journalists kind of get overlooked a little bit because they're just the voice behind the coverage, which is the main thing. That's why people are reading it, is because they want to know what we're writing about. And the person behind the writing isn't really like taken into consideration. And so I think that's just one thing that I think has been overlooked. And especially with like the F. King Alexander coverage. Um, we were also students at the university, also having to cope with what was going on personally and handle that, but we also had to like put our feelings aside and be there every single day covering it, and that was really hard to cope with and to work through. And we didn't have very many people who understood that in the beginning, is that we were also like, when it first happened, it was finals week, but we still had to report on it. And yeah, it was student journalists have definitely gone through the ringer. I mean, all journalists have the last year. So yeah.
Well, thanks so much for appearing with us tonight, JC. I mean, they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and I think that your leadership, in particular, like I was saying back in the beginning of this broadcast, that you guys still managed to bring home a lot of awards this year from the Society of Professional Journalists, a very prestigious organization, especially in such a hot competition seat of papers over 10,000 circulation. You guys still managed to do a tremendous job, and I think your leadership and your steady-handedness fielding all of these really intense issues, like has been one hell of a news cycle, and you've not only managed to survive it but excel at it. So hats off to you, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Stephen Forrester, president of EO Media. I'd like to hear a little bit about you, and along the same lines, if you could give us a moment or two about your life as a journalist, sir, and things at EO Media, particularly any challenges and opportunities that have occurred with your outfit since the pandemic struck.
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate this. I appreciate being exposed to all of the others here. Ours is a family-owned company, been family-owned since about 1908. My grandfather, who was the original founder, worked on the barometer at Oregon Agricultural College. And my father did as well at Oregon State College. My background journalistically is I was one of the 5 principals that started Willamette Week in 72, 73, whatever it was. I left after we ran out of money, had to sell the paper, and I became a correspondent in Washington, D.C. I did that for 10 years, covered Oregon, Washington, Idaho politics back there. Came out here, and for 30 years, I was the editor of the Daily Historian, retired about 3 years ago. Our papers cover a broad geographical area and as well as a cultural range. We have papers in Pendleton, Astoria, Enterprise, John Day, Baker City, La Grande, Most recently, we acquired the Bend Bulletin out of bankruptcy and have struggled but succeeded at resurrecting that paper. We've always historically, going way back, sought the latest technology. All of our managers and owners have had that in common. And we went online as early as 1996 was our first corporate online manager. She supervised the entire, then very primitive for us, online operations. Most recently, just this week, we were chosen by the Facebook Journalism Accelerator program to one of the 30 papers they're working with this year. It's all about growing the digital subscriber base. And just tangentially, in this world that is all about survival, we are creating a fund for Oregon rural journalism within the confines of the Ford Family Foundation in Roseburg. Concept's very simple, is to find philanthropic money to support newsrooms in rural Oregon newspapers. It's the pandemic, it's common to everybody. I mean, everybody said it in different ways, but what's happened is it has accelerated the pace of change within our industry. We're doing things now that probably were otherwise 5-10 years away, and we've had to do them in a hurry. We were very fortunate that we had just installed 3 platforms on our advertising side, and everybody's trained up before COVID hit. That's allowed our entire advertising staff to work from home, and with designers located here and there, build pages and show them to clients, show them proofs, and sell them. As a consequence, we did not take as big a hit as we thought we would have. We've been operating during the pandemic from a couple of scenarios that we created about, whatever, it's been a year ago. And one is called Winter is Coming, and I think another one is, the end is near, and so forth. And actually what has panned out is more like better weather. We cannot complain for a minute how we have fared. We've had, I think, Camilla of the Eugene paper said she had taken a couple of PPP loans. We have as well. And we've done layoffs as well, which I think the Mercury did. And those are they were very painful, but essential. Through one of the interesting aspects of our papers during pandemic is we've grown our subscriber bases. Both the print and digital are up. Not uniformly across the company, not in every paper, but in some markedly. So the digital subscription is a very lucrative subscription. You're not printing a paper for them. So that clearly is, for more than one reason, the future. The only other truism I would offer is, and I see it in the other papers that are been spoken about, is that when you're the size that we are, it's essential to sort of punch above your weight. And by that, what I mean is to do projects and coverage that is you'd expect from a much larger newsroom. In 2006, we did a company-wide series on climate change that was year-long. Won a prize for that, a national prize, and it was a challenge, but it was a very compelling series. If you take all of our papers together, you've kind of got the various ecosystems in Oregon. You've got everything from the coast and the Columbia River to the Umatilla Plateau and Eastern Oregon and so forth. We started to do the same thing. We renewed this series last year, now that we've added Bend, Baker City, and LeGrand, but COVID kind of intervened. So that's who they are, and that's what I am.
Excellent, excellent. Where, in particular with community journalism, where do you see the trends heading? With papers like Lee Enterprises, for example, downsizing and shrinking out of certain markets, other people picking up the slack. Where do you see all that going?
Yeah, Lee's a publicly traded company, I believe, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah. A community is better off, I would submit, having a family-owned paper than a publicly traded company, and certainly not a company that's run by hedge fund, which Eugene Register Guard is now. The truism, and it's true, is that the family takes a longer point of view. I think the Eugene Weekly person mentioned the owners of that paper, the Taylors. Incidentally, was that Fred Taylor who was at the Wall Street Journal?
Yep,
Yes.
that was
I see
Fred
Camilla
Taylor.
nodding. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know him. We knew him. We knew him well. Very interesting. But the yeah, it's a shame what's happened to the Corvallis Gazette-Times, and it's a crying shame what's happened to the Eugene Register Guard. And I'm just pleased to say that we've really rescued the Bend Bulletin, and it's as vibrant as it ever was. We're in a different location. Their building is what brought them into bankruptcy. So.
And I believe it, just as a quick aside, I think you had and maybe even still have a couple of OSU journalism folks working for you at the present time. I think Noah Nelson was with you at least over the summer, if not for longer than that. Lots of good fresh energy there as well.
We've had many. We participated in the Snowden program, which many of you probably know about. Marvelous program. We've been with them for years, and all of our papers have had an intern. Even the Capital Press, which is our agricultural weekly out of Salem, distinctly different piece of work. It circulates in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California, all about agriculture. And we got one of our best reporters ever from OSU, Sierra Dawn McLean, and just a marvelous writer, marvelous reporter. Yeah, we have OSU talent. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thanks personally for all the support and for appearing with us.
Yes, let me add one other thing. You asked where we get people and so forth. With the implosion of organizations such as, this started years ago, like Gannett, we picked up talent from Gannett and from Knight Ridder and so forth. And we our COO, Heidi Wright, was with the Bulletin before and came to us before we had the opportunity to buy the paper out of bankruptcy. So we've been very fortunate in who has come our way, and we rely on young talent.
You know, you could say the same thing just as an aside about academia as well. Ever since the job market in academia has begun shrinking as well, we've certainly got a lot of high-profile people from Columbia and other grads from very prestigious universities. I think that's also something that happens when a market is shrinking, is that a lot of talent will still keep rising up. So thanks for bringing up that point.
Yeah.
I'd like to turn the conversation to Jim Rondo, who's the station manager at KLCC FM. Jim, are you out there?
I sure am. Thank you,
Great.
Joey.
Can we get just a little bit about your history and the story at KLCC, in particular, any challenges and opportunities that have arisen post-pandemic and in this post-pandemic culture?
Sure, you bet. Well, I grew up in the Northwest. I grew up in Everett, Washington, reading the Everett Herald every day. I started my radio career at KRKO in Everett, and it's one of those full service stations where you cover the news and you play a few records. And I quickly realized early on that you could call the mayor and ask her a question, and she would pick up the phone. So I was kind of hooked. I did just about everything in addition to news over the years in Seattle, San Diego, and Los Angeles as a news anchor and a reporter, a program director, station manager. Came back to Eugene 2 years ago, and really based on my experiences having been in the radio business during consolidation, the alarm bells have gone off for me over the last number of years over the state of print journalism. I saw really the sad state of affairs that took down, well, almost in whole, the Orange County Register, and the Ventura County Star is no longer what it once was. And even the Los Angeles Times, until it got a new owner recently, was really on borrowed time. And it's just happened all over the country. And being in the radio business, we sort of shamefully admit that for many, many years, the local newspaper has been the assignment editor. I mean, even today, probably in the morning, the folks at NPR look at what's in the New York Times and the Washington Post and see if they're going the right direction, even though they have a full editorial process of their own. And I realized a number of years ago, and it's really become heightened recently, that as a public radio station with a newsroom and to cover the community responsibly, we have to be more capable of day and date coverage than any radio station in recent years has been. I saw in the radio consolidation of the late 90s and 2000s that there was a lot of talk about how the consolidation, the reduced overhead or the shared overhead of multiple stations would allow a 24-hour newsroom and the addition of reporters and editors and all this wonderful stuff, but it never did any of that happen. The sales staff sometimes increased, but the content creators certainly did not. And in many cases, it's just a computer sitting on a desk these days. So our effort at KLCC, which is a 10-station regional network owned by Lane Community College in Eugene, is to build our own content creation capacity. Luckily for us, we're nonprofit as a licensee of an educational institution. So that means we're mission driven. I don't know that anybody really is in the print world for profit motives so much at all these days either, but we have sort of a long history of being driven by community service as a nonprofit, and the bulk of our financial support comes from members who like what we do. So we cover on various signals all the way from Bend to the coast, north to Albany, Lebanon, Corvallis, Philomath on 89.7, and then south to Roseburg. And we're one of three major public radio systems in the state of Oregon, OPB out of Portland, and to the south of us, Jefferson Public Radio in Ashland. So our effort to ramp up, to increase content creation, to hire more journalists began actually when I showed up on the scene in 2019. And we were able to do that slowly, but add a few people to the newsroom fairly quickly. And I have to say it really paid dividends in our ability to cover the terrible Oregon wildfires last year, various street protests, of course, that we were all trying to cover, and then certainly the pandemic. But like everyone here, I'm sure we have a list of 8 stories we'd like to get on the air tomorrow, and the capacity to do 3 of them. And in the case of radio, the other concern is not the coverage in terms of producing a story, but it's being able to produce long form coverage when it's needed. In our case, we are a charter member of National Public Radio, which started 50 years ago this year, I believe. KLCC actually started at Lane Community College in 1967. And like most community colleges, they at the time probably had no idea really what to do with it. But 4 years later, NPR started, and that's been really the backbone of its service since then. And it's allowed us to build an audience for really, truly high quality, nationally produced programs, which is almost a blessing. It's almost a curse, because we have to match that quality at the local level. And luckily in this region, we have a lot of talent that we've been able to hold on to so far. But in terms of COVID trends, because we're a radio station, there are just a certain number of people who have to stay in the building and push buttons. And that was a big concern in the early days of the pandemic when we just weren't sure what was safe and who could be with whom and what precautions needed to be taken. So for the last year, we've basically had the entire news staff that was ordinarily working in the building and exchanging ideas and the creative process and the communication that a lot of us in the communications building are not in the communications industry are not great at, kind of happened organically, and we had to recreate that through email and various other ways because we just weren't all in the same place. But that kept our news anchors, the folks who are compiling hourly newscasts and acting as the traffic cops for what goes out on the air, they could stay in the building safely, and everybody else kind of went home. And that's the state of things to this point. But we were fairly lucky that we were able to, we had a staff of people who knew how to post things on the website, knew how to record with their smartphone, knew how to edit on their home computer. So it hasn't been as big a lift as you might think. And it's really opened up for us new ways of thinking about the future and ways that we can cover outlying rural communities in ways that we probably may not have considered really feasible in years past. So as terrible as COVID has been, it's really freed our mind to a new model of producing and disseminating the news.
Well, thanks so much for appearing with us tonight, Jim.
You bet.
I'd like to finally turn the conversation over to Stephen Schultz, the publisher of the Corvallis Advocate and also the sponsor of this evening's events. I'd like to shoot some of the same questions to you, Steve, a minute or two on your history and the life and role of the Corvallis Advocate in the way that the community journalism is emerging in the Corvallis community, especially post-pandemic.
Sure, thanks, Jillian. So yeah, history. I don't know what it says about me, probably not anything too positive. That, at 6 years old, I published my first newspaper, so don't be that guy. The other piece of it is I was pretty news conscious, reading a couple of daily papers a day by the time I was 10, watching network news. Don't be that guy, but I am, so it is what it is. The other piece of it is, at some point in life, I'm an evil ex-Californian. I bumped into the LA Weekly, and dude, changed my life. Okay, like you can do this with journalism, and there can be this kind of storytelling aspect. And at the time, what they were really cool at was taking these long form investigatives and really breaking news with their investigatives. The other thing they were great at is taking stuff everybody was covering and looking at it all and going, wow, we think the mainstream newspapers in town, which at the time were no slouches, have this wrong. And they would kind of go back through the same journalism and right that ship and really change the discussion at both the major papers, really 3 major papers at the time in LA. I thought that was awesome. And then you find like these really deep personal essays along with that stuff to kind of let you know that in your headspace, as weird as it felt, you were not alone. All in the same 84 freaking pages, which, by the way, was totally free of charge. Okay? I mean, wow. I was completely blown away. So at some point or another, I went, wow, Corvallis in, the year 2012 was not going to have, an 84-page alt weekly. But some of that same sensibility, that's where I come from. That's what I care about. That's what I want us to be doing. And, I also saw, frankly, when we started, the GT was really not in my head other than these are gaps. These are things they don't do. So cool, we're in our lane, they're in their lane. They frankly kind of weirdly took it personal that we're here, which was weird because it's like, none of this is aimed at you. Over the years, they kind of went from, they had 6 full-time reporters, a longtime editor, a lot of part-time people doing entertainment. I think they had about 8,000 subscribers at the time. At this point, they have half of all of that. I would frankly say they only have themselves to blame for some of that reduction. So it was that's kind of where we were at. What's happened over time is when they lost a lot of that capacity, we chose to fill in some of those gaps where we could. The other piece of it is we've been challenged over the years. And so as we approached the pandemic, what had really happened was we had, I would say, the first couple of years at The Advocate were pretty good creatively and journalistically. We really hit this point where some egos came into play at The Advocate. Some things had to be done. And honestly, it kind of sucked for a couple of years. And then we got this really cool editor, and she turned it around, kind of created, if you will, Advocate 2.0. And as we were headed into the pandemic, like I would talk to prospective advertisers, instead of them complaining about something the Advocate had just done, they'd be like, hey, what can you do for my business? And I'm like, oh, cool conversation. I like this. This is much more positive. People were like saying really cool things about the paper. The pandemic hit, and we realized in the space of a day or two, here's the back of the napkin calculations. Those took a whole 10 minutes, right? This is where we're at. And when we're done, we knew it was going to be a while. We knew this is at least 6 months, could be a year, could be a year and a half. We're going to wind up having to produce Advocate 3.0, and we're just starting to look at that now. We went to online only. We went from having a print paper that had been weekly at one time, had become bi-monthly, and doing our long form journalism there because it doesn't translate as well online. And the problem we've had, I think, is that we really are just starting to play properly at looking at multimedia so we can kind of convert some of that long form into an online only environment and have it really live there the right way. I will say that there's a hankering to get back to print from our readers. I think the public wants that, which to me is insanely interesting. As a publisher, I'm completely agnostic about this. Whatever the public wants, you want it on a post-it patch, tea leaves, I'm willing. Just so long as you're reading actual news that's been gathered by somebody, that would be awesome. Read actual news. Read interesting thought, right? So that kind of thing. So I don't know what that says, but that's where we were at. We went to online only. We're looking at a return to print sometime in the next several months.
Now, Steve, do you see the community changing around the Advocate, or is it more like journalism in Corvallis is needing to change to reach this community and maybe even galvanize the community?
Both. So one of the things I had in mind when I started The Advocate is it was like, man, if you do some decent reporting and express some thought, you can start to unify people, especially if you're willing to meet with people from diverse backgrounds. If you kind of do at The Advocate, what our staff isn't necessarily conscious of, or anybody else for that matter, once or twice a year, we'll spend a half a day gathering people together that don't like us and getting them in a room so they can talk to us about, what they think. And we kind of have them meet with people who do like us or are agnostic. That's been really helpful. So I believe we have to respond still in that space where I think we've been on, as a country, we've been on a 10-year outrage binge, man. And so bringing some coolness to that and some light to that rather than heat, certainly something we need to be doing. We still are, I will be honest, we're not quite as snarky as we used to be, but we're still a little snarky. So there's still that. My experience with conservatives in the community have been at times they've been really angry with us. And I've noticed that where we have tamped it down a little bit and been careful to be more fair with them. They don't necessarily need to agree with us to respect us. And we've built some fairly good relationships where with people who don't agree with us and are really clear they don't agree with us. But and it's having a sense of humor has helped. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers that.
It answers many things. I'd like to take a minute now to thank everybody for appearing with us this evening. And I'd like to cut back to my co-moderator, Kara Nixon, and see if we can explore some of the questions maybe that our viewers have piped in with during the meantime.
Yes, definitely. We can now turn to some audience questions. So for this first question, a viewer is asking about paywalls, and he points out that people getting food stamps and utility assistance also need well-vetted and reliable information and may not have access when those paywalls are in place. So I know Steve Forrester, EO Media has paywalls. So what do you think about these concerns?
We do open the gate when there's an emergency. But we have to be paid for our product. So that's the logic. We've been around the block on this over the last 10 years. But yeah, you're very observant. It has just gone into effect for the whole company. Yeah, we do open the gates when there's a community emergency.
Gotcha. And then Steve, the advocate, also has paywalls. Can you talk about what you think about these concerns?
I don't disagree with this guy. I used to marvel. Part of the magic for me was, wow, this thing is free. What the hell? So, I hate the loss of that. The economics of the business are the business community is no longer going to support in a market at least this size, or at least in this market. I don't anticipate that they're going to completely support us being completely free. So I just think that's the reality of it. Being blunt, we could never survive on our current level of subscribership, but we couldn't survive without them either. So that's where I'm at. I have had some fairly eviscerating emails about this over the last year, and a little bit on social media. And my response has become very polite and understanding, which is, I just feel it's very important that the community take the responsibility to help support the workers at the Corvallis Advocate. The hours that go into creating these forums, man, there's a lot of behind the scenes people. If you can come up with $45,000 for a GoFundMe for a bar downtown, and I'm not begrudging the bar getting $45,000 in contributions over the pandemic. I don't begrudge that at all. You can pony up $5 or $10 a month. And I'm sorry we have to ask, but the model's just not what it was 10 years ago.
Weigh in on that, Kara?
Yeah, go for it.
On that one. I absolutely agree that when there was emergency information that needed to be disseminated quickly for people's safety, we did, in my old world, we did the same thing. When there were floods hitting the county, there was no paywall on that. And while I don't recall this happening, if there were something like an active shooter or something in the area, I'm sure that would be the same. But I disagree that that's always the way it should be. The way I used to explain it to people was, if you're hungry and you've got food in your kitchen, but you don't feel like making dinner and you order a pizza, you expect to pay for that pizza. Somebody made that pizza for you. You could have made dinner all by yourself, but you chose not to. It is the same with information that a newspaper gathers. Public information is exactly that. It is public. You can go down to that council meeting and watch it yourself. You can call up the police every single day if you want to, and you can get a report of what they've done that day. It's public. You're public. You don't have to wait for the newspaper to give it to you. Get it yourself. But if you do ask the newspaper to get it for you, or whatever we're calling a newspaper, they're going down, they're doing the research, they're making the phone calls, they're doing the fact checking, they're putting putting it together in a readable form, by God, that's worth something. That is worth something. And we are right to charge for that. And I don't know how to make people understand that, because we have been giving it away and we shouldn't have been. That's where I am.
You know, I want to add to something that Jennifer's talking about, which is somebody pointed out in one of the journals, one of the trade websites early on in the pandemic, look, there's a model for getting the grocery store paid and the grocery workers paid. There is a model for getting the doctors paid, even when the patient or the grocery shopper can't afford it. I mean, there's SNAP, there's Medicare, Medi-Cal, whatever it is. You know, journalists also need to be paid, and there doesn't seem to be a model for that. Well, the model is, if you want access, you're probably going to need to pay.
Got it. All right. The next question we're going to move on to is from a viewer who works in the media. So they're asking how the media can offer meaningful coverage of police violence in the country when the media itself is often not trusted. Specifically, how can news organizations ensure marginalized voices are heard, even with said distrust? I'll start with you, JC.
Yeah, so I think that, say if we're reporting on a BLM protest, there are I don't think that a news organization should interview a police officer just to get the other side. That discounts everything that the protest is about if we're interviewing maybe an organizer who is talking about defunding the police. And that's just a personal opinion, can do a separate story on the police officer's perspective. But I do think that there are scenarios where you do need to, like, journalists need to remember that, like, we aren't trusted, and that there is harm in not trying to discount what someone is saying, but by going to the other side and getting their perspective, it could be harmful. You know what I mean? And so, like, things like that in journalism, like just the simple things like who we interview, the words that we use to describe somebody, those are really impactful in situations like that. And journalists and the media need to be more conscious of the language we use, the perspectives we get, just the perspectives of the story itself um, tells the story and talks about, or and how do I want to describe this? I'll just say that the media needs to be more conscious of the way we write the stories. That's something that we really needed to, or the barometer navigated in the beginning when a lot of BLM protests were being organized in downtown Corvallis, because we were having conversations about that. Like, well, do we go interview the police officer that's just in the station down the road? But why does that matter when we're writing about the protest? And we can interview the police officer for a separate story about their perspective or something. I don't know. That was a long-winded way of answering that, but that's something that I thought about a lot when all of the protests were happening, and I've been really conscious ever since to make sure that, we're doing our part to report the truth, but doing it in a way that doesn't hurt anybody.
Thank you. And then Steve Humphrey, you're from the Portland Mercury, and there was a lot of protests going on in Portland last year. So do you want to touch on this question as well?
Well, I think JC nailed it. But the only thing I'd like to just add to that is I do think it's really important to not just always report or get the opinions of like the city council person or the mayor or the cops. Who is it impacting? And we have to get their voices into that story.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And then this next viewer is asking if any of the panelists have had experience with a local news nonprofit model. If you have or haven't, can you give your opinion on the model? And then going off of that, do you see paths to business models that will better sustain journalism? I can start with you, Camilla.
I'm kind of smiling for a minute because we joke that we are a nonprofit for profit because there's no profit taken out. I think there are advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, we're not a true nonprofit, and we've talked about it, and we're not actually going to go that direction right now, or I have no idea of foreseeable future. My understanding, and I would look to Jim about this, is, for example, that would affect our ability to do endorsements. And as hotly debated as those are, to the point where I dread them every time. Next week is the endorsements issue. Yay. We wouldn't be able to do that. And actually, our readers do find it really helpful to have our reporters do these extensive interviews and talk to people. So it's not a direction we've gone. We have teamed up with nonprofits. And actually, we have a really amazing partnership with the Catalyst Journalism Project at the University of Oregon that has produced some amazing journalism. And in fact, the F. King Alexander story was actually broken by one of their proteges, Kenny Jacoby, who's now with USA Today, started off with Catalyst and a Eugene Weekly intern. So I think there's a lot of advantages to being able to team up with that. There's also Investigate West and some other groups that do amazing, and I think is really beneficial for those of us who are not nonprofit to be able to work with them.
Great, thank you. And then Rob, you mentioned earlier that you were an education reporter for the, oh, sorry, Jim, did you want to weigh in there? You can weigh in.
Just thought I should raise my hand because KLCC is in fact a nonprofit organization, and having worked in commercial news and in a mission-driven nonprofit model owned by an educational institution, I will say that there's really no comparison at all in the way that we approach covering the news, because our coverage is not geared toward pleasing advertisers. Frankly, as a radio station, I don't have to be the highest rated station around. It just so happens we are one of them. I assume as a newspaper, you would have to please a certain constituency to survive as a commercial entity. And I think we've heard a couple of times about which way a newspaper leans, as a liberal paper or a conservative paper. And that is something that we certainly have our limitations, and Camilla pointed to one of them. As an institution, we do not, for example, endorse candidates. We don't take sides on political issues. You'll hear people on the air who do, but it's not our position as the House organ to tell you what to think, but we will go out and find people who have different perspectives. And so to me, and I think it's very interesting, for example, in the print world to watch, for example, the Salt Lake City Tribune, which is now fully nonprofit after the Huntsman family spun it off into a nonprofit entity. It just has a lot of advantages over the commercial world in that we can have members support us. We don't have a paywall because we don't need to sell subscriptions. It's just basically all on an act of good faith, and somehow or other it works. We've actually had our membership increase during the pandemic when a lot of people were on difficult economic times, and we're very grateful for it.
Great, thank you. Steve, did you have anything to add? I know you've done research into nonprofit models.
Yeah, I've gone the same road as Camilla, looked at it and went, yeah, not for us, maybe as a hybrid model. Two other things I would add to that. I've been on nonprofit boards. I can't see any group other than a nonprofit board as being a typical case for what you don't want running a newspaper. These are risk-averse people, and they know people in the community, and they get pissed off when you piss somebody off in the community. It's just not a good combination. The other thing I want to say is endorsements, I think, are critical. I think that we as journalists have access to day-to-day handling and experience with information and elected folk that other people don't get. So our opinion can be useful in that way. The other piece of that, though, is I think it serves to help disclose to some extent the bias of a publication. I think it is useful to know that the Corvallis Advocate has a staff that decided, yeah, we should endorse Kate Brown for governor. We think she rocks. I think it's useful to know the Gazette Times endorsed Newt Bueller for governor, which they did, which was weird. But it's useful that you know that those are the two newspapers with the two staffs, and you can like Kate Brown or not like Kate Brown, but you know where we're coming from. Same with Newt Bueller and the GT. So I just think there's a matter of public disclosure and saying what you think.
Great, thank you. I was just going to ask Rob, since you mentioned that you're an education reporter at the GT in the past, this person is asking specifically about taking a more critical look at K through 12 education, specifically in Corvallis. And they want to know, do you think readership and subscriptions might increase if the media took a more critical look at what is taking place in our public K through 12 education program? And can you just speak to the importance of critically looking at local schools in the community?
Well, I just think that newspapers, and I think everyone on this panel would agree, are better served by taking a more critical look at everything, whether it's K-12 schools or the local policing or neighborhood cleanup or whatever. And I think that the one thing that if I had to live my journalism life over again, especially when I was at the GT, I would have listened more to the community. And I would have, as Steve Humphrey and others have said, really go out there to the people who are impacted and tell their stories and share that with the community. And I just think that if you're doing that as a journalist, and what I'm hoping to impart to young journalists, just like Jennifer is doing at OSU and that JC is demonstrating to us tonight, is that they're getting these basic skills in storytelling, but it basically comes down to a human level. And you have to listen, and you have to, legitimately hear what people are saying and then convey that to the larger public. And I think if we as journalists do our job right, as Jim Rondeau mentioned, you will have the support. People will sign up, they'll become members. And I think that, it's incumbent on all of us is just to be better at what we do.
Thank you. And then as a final question, I'm going to pose the question of, what do you think are the biggest takeaways that you want people who are watching to take away about local journalism and how the community can support local journalism, and what you see and what you want for the future of journalism? I'll start with Jim.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems that I see is the whole choose your news phenomenon right now. And if people get their news from social media these days, I hope it's from a legitimate publication that employs reporters and editors and fact checkers, and all of that's expensive. But any one of us could, put up a website tomorrow and call it the Eugene whatever, the Portland whatever, and have that stories go viral all over the world. And we've seen half of all print newsroom jobs disappear since 2008, according to Pew Research recently. So the number of people who are actually producing responsible news these days is really declining, and it's a big problem. It's a big problem for more than just those of us in the news industry. Obviously, that's why people are watching. You get fewer people running for office. Less local investment because they know that there's not a watchdog shining a light on local government. All of these things are huge problems. And in some cases, I think we're not going to know how bad they are until, there is a news desert in a certain place, and corruption thrives. And, we have communities like that. I take calls from people concerned about what's going on in the local community fairly regularly. So I think perpetuating a healthy media ecosystem, whether it's for profit or commercial, is really critical to good governance and our way of life.
Great, thank you. And did anybody else have anything to add to that? Camilla?
I was going to add that I don't know anyone who got into journalism or gets into journalism because we want to hurt people or screw up the world. Journalists are curious. Journalists are, we're interested in digging. If we dig up dirt, it's because we want to expose it and make things better. I think sometimes when we get in the discussion of objectivity and such, people forget that in an effort to be fair, we're trying to be fair, but we're also trying to actually to make a difference. And if we screw up, we want to be good journalists. We want to be told we screw up, and we want to correct it right away, because we don't want to have screwed up. So I think people are always surprised when they contact me and say, hey, you made a mistake, or you did this. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, here, let me get this fixed right away. Thanks for your feedback. And they're like, oh, that was easy. And I'm like, yes, because that is what a journalist does. We want to get out accurate information. It's not, it's about the information, not about the ego.
Thank you. And then JC, I see you have your hand raised, and then I'll go to Steve Schultz.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that, that like we do listen and care about what people have to say. It's more often that I get hateful emails of people who are disagreeing about the coverage, and that's just what happens when we write something controversial that or that challenges people's views. And it's less often that I get something in my inbox that's encouraging or just saying, hey, you're doing a great job. But even the emails that disagree with what we're writing, I listen to those. And during the F. King Alexander stuff, I actually didn't get very many of those emails. And there was so much love and support on Twitter. I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been following the barometer through all of that. And ever since then, everyone's support has been really helpful. And I just want to say that, yes, journalists aren't always evil. We do truly care about what you have to say, and we do listen to you, and we do want to do better and be better. Yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, JC. So we'll end with input from Steve Schultz.
Yeah, I'll expand on something JC just said. It is interesting that you can cover an issue in such a way as you've covered both sides of it or several aspects of it better than anybody has covered any of the aspects of it, and get thank you notes from every side of an issue just because you did your job thoroughly. If you do your job thoroughly, even if people don't love everything you do, they will respect it and they will care about keeping you around. I hope that doesn't get lost. I think that you find this inclination at established outlets that do corrections and have policies and procedures in place. So the idea that you're going to bump into news online, in social media, where some algorithm is deciding what you see, seems really kind of unintentional and frankly silly. You need to pick a few outlets that you trust, that are generally well accepted. You should be reading local news. I always like to tell people is, look, if you don't want to overdo it, spend 30 minutes a day, 10 minutes local, 10 minutes national, 10 minutes international, mostly read it, but pick news outlets that are generally well trusted, not just that you trust, but that people you respect generally trust as well, and then try to get some dissenting opinions now and again. So that's kind of my take. Read actual real news.
Great, thank you. And with that, that's all the time we have. So thank you everybody for watching. And as a reminder, please do subscribe. Thank you to everybody that joined our panels tonight. We really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to speak with us. And thank you to the Corvallis Advocate staff who do all the work behind the scenes and make these CitySpeak events possible. Thank you again to our supporters, Peak Sports and First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op. And with that, the CitySpeak is adjourned. Good night.